Now, the West really could smash Russia if it wanted to. It could destroy Russia with even tougher sanctions, like banning its gas exports. But it doesn't dare because that would backfire. The West is now too exposed, too dependent on Russia and what it exports. Just on gas, Europe needs Russian gas for 40% of its supplies. And that's just for starters. Joining me is Robert Gottliebsen, columnist with the Australian newspaper, who has more than any other journalist, I think, been right on top of a great weakness of the West, including right here. Robert Gottliebsen, thank you so much for your time. But first, before I get onto that, do you think the sanctions imposed on Russia by the US, Britain, Germany, Australia and others are going to work?
No, they can't. They can't because if you're playing the sanctions game, then you must not be, your opponent mustn't be able to hit you too hard. Now, you mentioned gas and oil, and that's of course, but there's a worse situation. In the modern world, the chip is like oil 20 or 30 years ago. And yes, we make chips, the Western world make lots of chips, but they need the Russian raw materials, the CF4C gas, the neon, the palladium, and that all comes from Russia. We can't make chips. We can't run our computer society without Russian raw materials. And then Boeing, the whole aerospace industry, depends on Russia for titanium. So if you get into a sanctions war, we're going to be hit as hard as Russia. So it won't happen. And that's why the share market has moved up a bit today in Australia and looks as though it may be moving up overnight.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned titanium, for instance. I mean, this is the thing. They're so smart. Russia and China now probably dominate the titanium sponge market. So that's, the titanium treated with chemicals. And it's very important for making things like, jets,
yes.
And military as well, including American jets. And the thing is, you'd be killing yourself if you really wanted to impose a total shutdown of Russia. And they know it. They have done this deliberately, China and Russia, by flooding the market with underpriced imports to drive out competitors and establish critical markets. We've been asleep at the wheel in this sort of game.
I think that's pretty kind, really. We've been just stupid, like really and truly, allow your country or the West to be dependent on Russia or China or anybody else like that for these key raw materials and simply be sucked in by a low price. Like the Chinese, in this case it's the Russians, just laugh at us because we've been too silly. And that's why we can't play sanctions. I think what will happen over time is that we're going to have a cyber war. And that'll be pretty serious. In a cyber war, we can match them. It's interesting that Russia, in the early stages, actually tried to woo the Americans by arresting one of the gangs. Those gangs these cyber gangs will now be let loose. And that arrest also confirmed that Russia does in fact have these cyber raiding gangs. So our companies are going to have to be very aware that, encouraged by the government, those gangs will attack our corporate internet structures. But they do more than that.
Robert, I just want to turn this conversation to Australia particularly, because my fear is not just that our armed forces are not strong enough, that they don't have the right weapons for an existential threat like China. I think our economy, and this is the really concerning thing for me, and you've touched on this, you've written about this, I worry that our economy could be just switched off, almost like a flick of the switch, if China and its allies really wanted to punish us. And it might just be with bans on trade or cyber attacks, as you mentioned, or a naval blockade. I don't think we've made our economy anywhere near as self-sufficient as Russia has deliberately tried to do. How much trouble do you think we're in?
Oh, you can just look at what's happening now with COVID. The amount of goods that we need from China just to keep the place going. And we haven't had bans, but we've seen from COVID how difficult it can be in the supply chains. Our iron ore is keeping us going. That's what's keep driving it. And what do you think the Chinese are doing? they're working on ways to stop the futures trading in China on iron ore, to try and get that price down. Now, we're very vulnerable. And like, worse than that, we have not made a good defence investment at all for the last 20 years. JSF, Joint Strike Fighter, was no good. We've mucked around with submarines. We've messed up helicopters. The frigates is a total mess. And the people who have made many of those mistakes are still there. They've changed the minister, and Dutton did his best with the submarine situation, but he hasn't fixed the frigate. So there's a lot of work to be done there too. And just right now, we're in no position to resist a really nasty situation from China.
No, I think we need an absolutely full court press on national security. And it's not just military hardware, it's the economy, it's cyber defences, it's the whole thing. Robert Gottliebsen, thank you so much for continuing to raise this very, very important issue. Appreciate your time.